So you've read the title and you've said, what the heck is part 3? I don't even recall a part 1 or a 2. But then there's going to be some of you, the OG bunch, if you will, who would have been waiting for this video for almost an entire year. And I'm kind of sorry. G'day legends, it's Jono from Thermaltake Australia, and I'm finally getting around to rounding off the building a 1080p gaming build in 2020, part 3 in 2021. As I said, some of you will have no idea what I'm even talking about, so I'll pop a link to part 1 up here. But the lowdown for those who need a refresher is that in part 1, I gave you all some of my tips for piecing together a part list for your first build, including how to research, view performance benchmarks, see compatibility issues, and how to score some good deals too. Now, I did all of this based around a 1080p gaming PC with a budget of around 1500 AUD for my brother-in-law. Today, I want to share with you what parts I ended up choosing and why I chose them and how it all fared in the end, especially since it was built just pre the gaming GPU price disaster. CPU. Kicking it off with the CPU, the keen-eyed bunch of you would have spotted that I went with the AMD 3300X and not an AMD 3600, which most people would assume. When it purely comes to 1080p gaming performance, which is what this entire build was based around, the difference between the 3600 and the chosen 3300X in price is not worth the performance difference a 3600 brings. And for an awesome price of 239 AUD, you couldn't beat that at the time. The motherboard. There are only a couple of restraints with this build. Maybe I should say parameters instead, but essentially, I needed to go for a Wi-Fi based motherboard while sticking to budget, which isn't exactly an easy feat. Nonetheless, I ended up with the MSI B550M Pro VDH Wi-Fi. It wasn't the cheapest board around with Wi-Fi available, but at the price of $199, which was on special, it was the cheapest B550 with Wi-Fi. And I really wanted to go B550 because out of the box, it would be compatible with the 3300X and would also be ready for a new gen CPU should an upgrade come down the line. RAM. Now here's where I cheated a little bit. I was able to use the perks of working here to get a cheeky deal on a 16 gig 3200 MHz Tough RAM RGB kit, only because the brother-in-law really wanted some RGB goodness for the build. However, if the discount wasn't a factor, then I still would have chosen 16 gigs of 3200 MHz RAM, but in a non-RGB variant like our Tough RAM RC. The reason I went with 3200 MHz over 3600 MHz is once again the fact that when it comes to gaming performance between the two, there's only a tiny difference. In fact, it's pretty much impossible to tell the difference in real-world scenarios. The graphics card. Oh boy, so for this one, I'm happy to say we got in at the best possible time. For this build, I scored my brother-in-law a Gigabyte 1660 Super Gaming OC, the 3-fan edition, for an amazing price of 350 Australian dollars, which at the time was a splendid deal, but if you look at the 1660s now and their prices, wow. It's insane to think a year later that card would be now sitting around at $650 or higher. Now, I don't want to hype up the 1660 Super too much because right now you should not be buying one if you can help it. But at its launch and for a bit after, it was a seriously competitive card for the money, and it was really hard to recommend anything else for a 1080p gaming rig. The rest of the build. So to round out the rest of the build, for the long-term storage, I went with a 2TB Barracuda hard drive from Seagate, which you can pick up for around $80 Australian. And then for the OS and for games that he'd want to run as fast as possible, I opted to go with a 1TB Samsung 860 EVO SSD, which I can't really recall the price on, but having a fast, dependable SSD is always a welcomed addition to a gaming build. To power the hardware, there's a Thermaltake Smart BM2 550W or 550 watts PSU, which I think is an amazing value PSU considering it's bronze rated and semi-modular as well for around 119 Australian dollars. Now I've said it a million times and I'm happy to say it a million more, please do not ever skip out on a quality power supply. So make sure you pick up one with a bronze or higher 80+ rating if you can, and if you have to sacrifice modularity for it, that's fine. To cool down the CPU, I went with a Water 3.0 240mm all-in-one CPU cooler, and it's completely overkill for a 3300X, but once again, the perks of working here, I could get a sweet deal on it, and it also prepares the build for upgrades in the future too. For some awesome RGB goodness, I included a mixture of Ring Trio and Ring Plus fans that I had to obviously move air throughout the case, but also look good while doing it too. The case. Finally, to actually house everything, the case my brother-in-law decided on was our Thermaltake H550, one of our best-selling cases, and it's not too hard to see why. With that sleek front panel design that you can't see here, with a tempered glass side panel and interior space to house all full-length hardware. It's a case that looks great anywhere and it's able to handle any new hardware upgrades like a bigger graphics card or more hard drives. Changes. So that's the build I did back then, but if I had to do this again right now, that being August of 2021, would there be anything I would do differently? Of course, the main change would be the graphics card, which is obvious considering the cost of even the base model Nvidia 1660s are at 600 Australian dollars, and that's for the mini versions of the card, which no doubt would be loud and more often lack the proper cooling they really need in a gaming rig. However, the hard choice would be what card? Unfortunately, I would have to up the budget and go with the 6600 XT from AMD right now, as when you take in real world pricing, it's unfortunately the best value 1080p card for pure gaming performance. And I can already tell I have peed a lot of you off. The second big change would be the CPU. The AMD 3300X is seriously an awesome CPU, but I would actually make the change over to Intel's 11400. For around a $30 increase in price, the performance increase in applications and games is worth it, but you would also need to enable some settings in your motherboard's BIOS and have ample cooling to pull it off as well. Ample meaning pretty much anything other than a stock CPU cooler. So even budget tower coolers like our Tough Air series would be a great choice here. And because of the change in CPU, that would mean our motherboard choice would also need to change, but that's not a hard thing to do, as the H510M models are fantastic value for budget systems, and there's a few models with included Wi-Fi as well. Well, there you have it. I'm finally happy to end this saga of 1080p gaming build log thing, whatever it is, part 3. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you liked it, make sure you hit the thumbs up. If you didn't, make sure you hit the dislike button twice. If you do have comments that you want to add or have questions about the entire build process, feel free to drop them down below and we'll get back to you. Otherwise, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we do have the $1,600 budget build guide coming out real soon. If not, it's probably up here already. Check out this other video here. And that's about it. Thank you so much, and I will see you sometime in the future.